Thank you very much for coming back to the second session of the keynote speech. I'm very sorry that I was talking with the keynotes that they were having jet lags and I lost sleep. And in the previous opening speech, I was unable to read the thing subtly and then had a short circuit in my brain. So I apologize for that. And then now, for this sake, I will not read Professor Rachel Ngai's introduction. I will just give you a very brief introduction of my first impression of her. We know I know her long time ago in 2004 when I was doing my master's at the London School of Economics. At that time, she was already a professor there, graduate from Pennsylvania University at London School of Economics. And she just mentioned that we have some people mistakenly recognize her here as a graduate student. But, I mean, this is 10, 15 years later. Imagine at that time when she was at LSE, she was often mistaken as a postgraduate because she was even younger than many of the students then at LSE. And so this is one of the legends that we have. And later on, of course, we know I know her from a long time ago when I was there. And from onwards, I read most of her papers, or actually all of her papers, and I was interested in structure change because her papers. Okay, so without further ado, I will, so her name, just correct me, the pronunciation, Rachel Ngai. Ngai is a Guangdonghua, Cantonese, and in Chinese is Wei. Her Chinese name is Wei Lihua. Okay, perhaps, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here. And thank you for the introduction. So Justin just gave an amazing keynote. So mine will be quite a different style. And also, in a way, a very different message. I think in the way two can be complementary together. So the keynote will be based on a paper joined with Chris Pissarides and Jin Wang at Hong Kong UST. So it's about labor market and the barriers in the labor market. And the focus here is some particular policy in China that is still in place that act as a labor market, a mobility barrier. So to start with a bigger picture, if you look across the world for the last 2 centuries, one of the most important economic phenomenon is what we call structural change, which Justin also mentioned about. So here, when I said about structural change, it's very much the way Kuznets define it. So if you look at the size of agriculture, both in terms of share of employment in agriculture or value added produced by agriculture, what we see is the decline in agriculture as economy become richer over time. So this feature we see across the world over the last 2 centuries. Okay, so it's something very important. So Kuznets, in his inferential book, document this pattern for 13 OECD countries. Madison also document for 16 OECD countries since 1870. Just to put everything in a picture, so this graph is borrowed from Harrendorf, Rogerson, and Valentini. Valentini is actually a professor at Manchester now. So what you see is on the x-axis, we plot the income of the country at the international comparable level. Sometimes we call it international dollar. And on the y-axis, we plot the share of employment in agriculture. This graph has 8 countries over the 200 years period. So all the dots there is the point of employment share and their income at a particular point in time. When you put them together, what you see is a very clear downward sloping relationship. So as a country gets richer, what we see is that the share of employment in agriculture falls. And it's quite substantial. You see countries with 80% of agriculture share employment go down to 1%. Okay? So in the US, if you look at the time series pattern of US, In 1870, there's about 50%, so half of the US population is hired in agriculture. By now, it's about 1%. So this is the pattern that we see around the world. We see the same pattern for China. So what I did here is that I choose the same axis. Y-axis is the share of employment in agriculture. X-axis is the income at the international standard. So what you see here from 1978, since the economic reform, to 2007, agriculture employment share in China has dropped by half, from 70% to about 30% in 2007. Now, there are many ways to look at this figure. You can say, oh, that was a dramatic change from 70% to 30%. So a lot of people has come out of agriculture. From another perspective, you look at 2007, and what you see is there is still 30% of employment in agriculture. How does that put in place of the historical content? Well, I can tell you 30% is equivalent to the agriculture employment share in the US 100 years ago, in 1920. Okay? So if you take that perspective, you might wonder, maybe the decline is not fast enough. Okay? That's a question. So that is the pattern of structural change. Then you say, if I'm not a labor economist, should I care about structural change? So let's think about some implications of structural change. There are many implications of structural change. One of the most important ones, and have made many great minds think about, is this important question. Why some countries are poor, whereas others are rich? This is the fundamental question for economics. And that's what motivated Adam Smith to write his famous book. So when he wrote the book, which is more than 200 years old, when he looked across the world, what does he mean by wealth of nations? What are the differences across these countries? Well, according to many historians, there are differences, but compared to today, it's quite small. If you look at income per capita, the ratio between the rich and the poor is about 2 at the time when Adam Smith was writing the book. But by the time that Hall and Jones write their famous paper, it has already increased to 40. So this question, this fundamental question, if anything, has become even more important in terms of magnitude, increased from 2 to 40. So there's a huge literature in economics still going on trying to answer this question. Why some countries are poor, why some countries are rich. From a structural change perspective, we see that transition out of agriculture is quite crucial to the answer of this question. Now, many development economists have talked about it. Okay, Alfred Lewis, who I read is related to Manchester, is one of the important questions. Transition out of agriculture. Why is that important? Well, first of all, it's to do with the dynamics. The timing. When do you start to leave agriculture? To leave the Malthusian style of economy, okay, where you only have extensive growth, meaning any increase in the GDP per capita, the GDP is offset by increase in population. As a result, there's no economic growth, no modern economic growth. That's the Malthusian type. Coming out of the Malthusian economy into what we call the modern economic growth is a very important step. Historians would call it turning point or take-off point. That's very important. As it turned out, to understand the timing of the takeoff, the timing of the turning point, affects our understanding of this factor 40 income difference a lot. Second, when you look at the point in time, say if you do a development accounting for the year 2010 on the income difference across country, what you find is the low productivity, the low aggregate productivity, has a lot to do with low productivity in agriculture. In other words, poor country has low productivity, but even lower in agriculture. Okay? If you look at the ratio of productivity of agriculture versus non-agriculture, it's much lower in the developing country. So that tells you that having people out of agriculture is very important for understanding the country's difference in their aggregate productivity. So one natural question you will ask is, well, this is quite puzzling. If poor countries have low productivity, particularly in agriculture, why do they have such large employment share in agriculture? Okay? Because when we look at the development path, we see this negative relationship. The poor countries have more people in agriculture. And that's also where they are less productive. This is puzzling. Why don't they move to a higher productivity sector? Okay? One immediate answer or intuitive way to think about it, there must be something that's stopping them from moving. Well, we can call that a general term, labor mobility barrier. Because of this mobility barrier, what we generate is people are in the wrong sector. There's a misallocation of labor. Now, Kuznets, in his book, he already foresees the importance of such barrier. As he writes, when he defined modern economic growth, he said that it's attainable only if the required market shifts in industrial structure are not too impeded by resistance, okay, of labor, capital, of people and their resources in the old and accustomed goods. So this is something that has been foreseen. If we want the structure change, the process of structure change to happen naturally, to contribute to modern economic growth, we have to remove this resistance, okay, to remove this barrier. So let's turn to a more economics practice, okay? So we talk about the idea, the historian's view, okay? The historical view. From a modern view, how do we think about mobility barrier? For those of us who have been trained in economics, think about what is this mobility, okay? Well, from your undergraduate, you learn in order for an individual to move from one sector to another sector, in equilibrium, we will have expect the marginal product of labor, the value of marginal product of labor to be equalized across this sector. Because that's where the economic forces, the market forces, will tell this individual to go. Okay? So what's the feature of mobility barrier? A feature of mobility barrier is it generates a gap between the value of marginal product of labor. So if you look at this equation, what it says is the value of marginal product of labor in agriculture, instead of equal to the value of marginal product of labor in non-agriculture, is equal to a fraction of it. So what does it mean? There's too many labor in agriculture, and it drags down the marginal product of labor. You have too many people there, and they make it less productive for the marginal guy. This marginal guy should not have been there. But because there's some barrier in the economy, as a result, he's there, and he dragged down the productivity in agriculture. So this is a typical equation people will put down when they say that's misallocation of labor, okay? Because the value of marginal product of labor are not equalized. Now, this is one mathematical equation. Then you come to the real world and say, what could have caused this? What could have made people not leaving agriculture and go into non-agriculture? What could be? Well, in the literature, there are a bunch of examples. There are education costs. You might need to acquire education to move to non-agriculture. There's social custom. There might be network, community network you have in your village. If you leave, you will lose it. Okay, so they are given for many different countries. So what we are going to talk about today is for China. What could we think when we look at China, where we see that the agriculture productivity is much lower than the non-agriculture? What is the contribution that makes this value of marginal product of labor not equalized? So one of the important candidates that we emphasize is the hukou system. So when you look at China, we see amazing growth, very fast economic growth, and also a big decline in agriculture employment. So the structural change has contributed to the fast economic growth in China. But when you do a growth accounting, some will argue China could have gone further if this process was faster. So there is something that is stopping it. So the question I want to ask in the talk or in the paper is basically, how does the hukou system affect the migration decision? What are its quantitative implications for the process of structural change and for the aggregate productivity? And what kind of policy evaluation and recommendation we can give based on the finding? Okay, so that will be the objective. So a small background, I'm sure most of the audience may know more than me on the hukou system, but just to set the same ground, a small background. So in early days, migration is basically forbidden. Later it was relaxed, and there's policy in place, but generally speaking, still there are two dimensions where we see there is restriction to labor mobility. One, we notice, is the land policy. So in China, farmers have the right to farm the land free of rent, because in an egalitarian society, land was distributed equally to the farmer. They can farm it. But if they don't farm it, they cannot sell it or rent it, because it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the state. That's the first dimension. The second dimension is the social subsidy associated with hukou. So if you're a migrant with a rural hukou and you move to the urban area, most of the time you do not get the same subsidy for education, health, or housing. Okay, so that's the two dimensions we have in mind. So how do they act as mobility barrier that slow down transition out of agriculture? That's the question we want to address. Now to do that, I do not just want to look at agriculture and non-agriculture, meaning leaving agriculture into some other sector. I want to distinguish the non-agriculture into rural non-agriculture and urban non-agriculture. First, we see that in China, township village enterprise play a very important role in the 80s. Okay? I will show you some number later on. Second, in terms of the hukou system, it matters whether you are rural non-agriculture or urban non-agriculture. So if I wanted to understand the role of this policy on the pace of industrialization and on the pace of urbanization, it's important to think about these two non-agriculture separately. So here's the graph for China. So we have the agriculture graph, which we've seen earlier, the decline of agriculture. And the green line is the urban non-agriculture, and the red dot is the rural non-agriculture. What I want you to take away is, in the case of China, rural non-agriculture is a very important sector, okay? Especially during the 80s, when it helps to absorb a lot of labor out of agriculture. Okay, so as I said, it's a very different style, so I'm actually going to show equations, fortunate or unfortunate. As economists, sometimes we think when we formalize idea, it makes it easier to apply to different scenarios. Okay? And that's what I will do to formalize the idea. So think about here's an economy where there's different type of individual. They are different because of the hukou they have. Some might have urban hukou, some might have rural hukou. They are different because they work in different sectors of the economy. Some are farmer, some work in the factory, some work in the restaurant. Okay? So they are different. They derive utility from consumption of both agriculture and non-agriculture goods. And non-agriculture goods can be produced both in rural and urban area. So this utility function is pretty much standard used in development economics. What is said is just two things. One, we have some substitutability between agriculture and non-agriculture. And in this case, is picked to be 1. And we also have some substitutability between non-agriculture goods in urban and in rural. The elasticity is eta. Okay? So they're producing similar kind of good, but in different locations, okay, with the budget constraint. And the production side of the economy is that there are three sectors. We make it very simple. Non-agriculture will only use labor. Okay? We abstract from capital. It could be added in very easily. The main idea will be the same. So you have a production function. You hire labor. With technology AJ, you produce some output. Agriculture production function is different because you need land. This is the key part. Okay? You need land. So think about the case of China. Land was equally divided. So each farmer gets some LAI units of land. He put that with the technology, okay, and his labor, which is 1. That's why it didn't show up in that production function. This will be the individual production for that one farmer. And then you can aggregate up. Okay? You add up all the farmers in the economy. Every farmer has the equal amount of land. Then you get the aggregate food production. So if you compare the aggregate food production and the aggregate non-agricultural production, the key difference is you see land showing up here. And the share of land is 1 minus beta. So 1 minus beta will be the key parameters throughout the paper. Okay? So very often, in order to think about distortion, we want to think about the economy without distortion. So this is what I'm going to do first. I'm going to do the case where we call first best, the best allocation in this world, meaning that technology is taken as given. I have the agricultural production. I have the non-agricultural production. How should labor be allocated? This gives us a benchmark when we look at distortion in the economy with these hukou policies. Okay? So that's what we are going to do. Imagine this is a case that everything is efficient, directed by the market. What's going to happen? Well, in this case, farmer will have to rent land in the market. Either you can think of from a, there's a land market. So there'll be a competitive market to rent land. They will get a return from their revenue and just pay the rent on the land. Okay? And then whoever collects this rent, let's say the state collects the rent. The state here will be like the benevolent social planner. He collects the rent, then he will redistribute to everyone with lump sum transfer. Or equivalently, you can say the land is owned by everyone, so the land that's paid go back to everyone. Okay? So that is just something very simple. So what does the individual get? They will get their wage working in a particular sector, WJ, and then they will get the lump sum transfer from the state. That will be the total income. So now we're at the point we can solve for the first pass equilibrium. So as a farmer, what is your return? Well, you will farm your piece of land, which you pay rent, and after that is your return. So we can call it WA. And as this is the first best, this WA is actually the same as the competitive wage in a competitive equilibrium. Okay? So it's simply the value of marginal product of labor. Okay? This is basically what it said. The non-agricultural worker also receive their value of marginal product of labor in the urban non-agricultural sector and in the rural non-agricultural sector. This is what they will be finding. So what is the mobility condition here? It's exactly what I showed you earlier on. The value of marginal product of labor should equal to the value of marginal product of labor in the non-agricultural sector. They should be equalized. That's the first best allocation. Okay? Once you do that, combining that with preferences, you can derive the employment allocation. Okay? This is just show you that you can derive it. Now, of course, if you look at this equation on the distribution between rural and urban, if people like the rural good a lot, then you will put more labor into the rural non-agricultural sector. Okay? So this is the preference that is driving the structural change. If there's more preference for the rural good, you will allocate more. This is where psi stems from. Okay? And similarly, depend on technology. If productivity growth is very fast in the urban, then you don't need as much worker in the urban sector. So therefore, that will increase the rural employment as well. So in the first best, the allocation is just driven by preference and technology. Okay? Similarly for the agriculture share, you will see that the preference, which is omega, is the weight you put on food. Okay? And beta is the technology, the role of land. Now, because land is only used in the agriculture sector, you will see that you don't need as much worker compared to your preference weight. So this is the first best allocation. Now, back to our original inquiry. How does the ecosystem affect this kind of employment allocation? So let me give you a little bit more detail on China's land policy, and then we can think about how do I want to model it in this model economy. Okay? Some important feature is that land is allocated according to the size of the household, especially who actively farm. So there's a risk of reallocation. So many social scientists, people who conduct survey at the village level, what they tell us, what they find is that this is quite very much in practice, meaning that they will very often check who is farming the land, whose family has people who went to work as a migrant worker and left the household, so that we evaluate frequently, okay? And this target of preventing uncultivated land was very much in place. And the slogan that use it or lose it is also something that is well known among the farmer and adopted by the village leader. So in other words, if you don't farm, there's a risk that the land will be gone. Secondly, you say, well, can they rent it out? Well, unfortunately, until very recently, there's very limited rental market. There is a development recently, but still it's very much pilot on particular village. Okay? In general, because you don't own the land, you cannot really rent it out. Another final point to notice is that most of the time, what we see is when migrants left, these are the people who are the one who had the labor. It's the young who left. And very often, both husband and wife leave the farm. Who is left behind are the elderly parents together with the children. So therefore, once they left, not much is going on that farm. So based on this observation, one simple way to model this policy is to say that if you leave your farm, you don't get any income from the farm. Okay? So that's the simple way to think about the scenario. So that way, what we can think is, when a farmer trying to decide, should I stay on the farm or should I go to the non-agriculture sector and become a worker? His trade-off is, if he leaves the farm, it is not just the marginal product of labor he gave up. It's the entire agricultural output. Because he cannot get back the rent. He cannot get back the rental part of the land. So therefore, in his mind, when he leaves, it's the whole output, which is the agriculture output. And where he landed it, when in the non-agriculture sector, is only the marginal product of labor. So what you see is, when you solve this kind of equilibrium, you find that the agriculture employment share in this case will be equal to omega. Now, if you remember my previous equation, the first best is less than omega, because land was used in agriculture. Whereas in this economy, with land policy, you find that the agriculture share will be larger. So go back to that misallocation equation. How do I illustrate the misallocation? Well, what the farmer equates is the whole output equal to the marginal product of labor. So in order to make the value of marginal product labor for the agriculture, you multiply the left-hand side with a beta, and therefore you have to multiply the right-hand side with the beta. So in other words, in this equilibrium, what happened is the farmer is setting the value of marginal product of labor in agriculture equal to beta times the value of marginal product of labor in non-agriculture. Beta is less than 1 because land share, which is 1 minus beta, is positive. This is where we see the mobility barrier. The land policy has translated itself as a labor mobility barrier, which distorted this equilibrium condition. Okay? So what we see is there's too many farmers relative to the first best. There's a misallocation of labor. And because there's too many farmers relative to first best, when you look at the average productivity in the farm, it will be lower than the first best. So this is help to reconcile what's happening in developing country when there is a labor mobility barrier. They have too many people in the agriculture, and the productivity in agriculture is too low. Okay? And the distortion clearly is that in this economy, farmers get the land for free, so there's an implicit transfer from the non-agricultural worker to the farmer. So now let's examine the full hukou system. Okay? So as I mentioned, there's two dimensions. One is the land policy, which I already showed how it distorts the equilibrium. The second one is the social subsidy. So here we have a fraction nu of population hold an urban hukou, and one minor nu hold a rural hukou. This nu is a policy parameter decided by the government, how many people should have urban hukou and how many should have rural hukou. Depending on your hukou, you receive subsidies. Okay, so if you have a rural hukou, you get subsidy in the rural area. If you're urban hukou, you get subsidy in the urban hukou area. So if you're a migrant worker, what happens is you go to the urban, you work, you pay the tax, either directly or your employer has to pay the tax, but you do not get any of the subsidies. Okay, so that is the second dimension of the distortion. So you can solve this equilibrium just like what we did before. You have an allocation within the non-agriculture across rural and urban. Compared to the first best, what you see is that now the subsidy is going to distort that equilibrium, because from the rural location to urban location, what you face is this distortion. Okay? You move to the urban, you pay the tax, but you do not get the subsidy. Okay? Now, for the employment share in agriculture, what you see is both the subsidy, okay, will show up, and also the absence of beta in this formula show up because land policy is distorting the equilibrium. Okay? Now, looking at the migration condition again, now you see two things happening. When you move from agriculture, this is the marginal product, value of marginal product in agriculture. When you move from agriculture to rural, there's one distortion because of this beta. Land is only used in the agriculture sector, not in the rural non-agriculture sector. So that's the first labor mobility barrier, to move out of agriculture. Furthermore, to move from rural to urban, what you see now there is an additional barrier, which is due to the subsidy associated with the hukou system. So there's two barriers coming in. The first one, land policy, is mainly to deter transition out of agriculture, so it has a very big impact on the pace of industrialization. Whereas the subsidy policy has the biggest impact moving from any rural area, agriculture or rural non-agriculture, into urban. And that will affect the urbanization pace. Okay, so this is basically how we can see this thing intuitively. Okay, so I already mentioned that land policy will affect mainly the agricultural worker, because by leaving farm, what they gave up is not just their marginal product of labor, but the entire farm output. So they suffer an income loss, okay, due to the share of land. Second, social subsidy that given to the urban hukou is going to affect any leave from the rural area into the urban area, because they pay tax, but they do not get the subsidy. What is interesting is in those formula, you do not see the role played by the rural subsidies. Okay? And this is quite specific to the way we model it, because we think of it as a regional budget balance. Okay? This point can be amended, but for now, what I want you to take away is the two key mobility barriers are the land policy, which show up in the parameter beta, and the subsidy for the urban area. The next step, so the intuition is very clear. We see that according to that migration condition, value of marginal product labor are not equalized across these three sectors because of presence of land, because presence of social subsidy. Okay? The next question is to say, how important are these barriers? So it's a quantitative question. Okay? Qualitatively, it's quite obvious. It's going to slow down the process. Quantitatively is, can we learn some magnitude, how big this distortion can be? Okay, so that's the objective next. So if you compare the agricultural employment share in the first place and in the policy equilibrium, so this policy equilibrium have both barriers in it already, you can ask, how big is this misallocation? Well, if you look at that equation, there's a clear message, what are the important parameters? The ratio of this difference depends both on technology and preference parameter, obviously. So technology is the importance of land in agriculture. Obviously, the more important is land, the bigger will be the distortion. If land is not important at all, land policy will not cause any distortion. Okay? And the policy parameter, okay? So what we are going to do is try to use the observed data to give us a way of backing out some numbers. Okay? Now, there are many parameters for the model. As it turns out, some are very important, some are not so important. And there's various ways to get to the numbers. So how do we do that? First of all, the policy parameters are important. Okay? These are the share of urban hukou, what percentage of population hold the urban hukou, the share of urban subsidies. Okay? Now, we can construct that from the data. Okay? Someone have done the urban hukou share for us based on the Chinese Statistic Yearbook and China Population Statistic Yearbook. So we just take it from him. The urban subsidy, though, there's no available statistic. So what do we have to do? We try to do our best. We go to various sources of Chinese Statistic Book on education, healthcare, pension, and other social assistance. So we use many different data sources. Surely, this is not the exact measure, but as an economist, this helps to give us some sense of magnitude. Okay? And it's always going to be a way to improve that measure as you, and maybe you can tell me something that I have left out from that. But that's how we are going to construct it. So these are the policy parameters. For completeness, we also show you the rural subsidy. So what you see is first of all, the data is only available from 1998 onward. So if you know anything before that, that would be very helpful. Right now, we only managed to do it from 1998 forward. So notice first thing is there has been an increase in urban hukou, okay? So from 25% to 35%. Urban subsidy has also increased from 5% to 15%. So there's an increasing trend for these policy, okay? So that's what we find from the data. Then other parameters that are important are three of them. Beta is the share of land. Fortunately, other people has estimated the production function and give us an estimate of how important of land is. It's about 49.49. So beta is 0.51. Okay? X and omega are not directly observable. What are we going to do? Okay? We cannot just assume people have a certain preference on agriculture. And the X was that slightly complicated function that show you the preference people have on rural agriculture, non-agricultural good versus urban non-agricultural good. So again, it's something to do with preferences and something to do with technology, which is productivity of the urban sector versus the rural sector. Now, instead of coming up these numbers from nowhere, we take quite an interesting approach, I would say. Here's what brave assumption we are going to make. We are going to say, let's suppose this model with hukou match China's employment allocation perfectly. let's suppose. And then we're going to remove this policy and see what is the first best going to look like without the policy. It's almost like a backward thing, okay? Because we can't see these preference parameters. So we say, suppose this is the way that basically how employment allocation is determined in China. If we remove this barrier, what would be the first best world? Okay? So that is the logic of the exercise. It's not perfect, but it helps to give us a sense of magnitude. So when we do that, we computed this graph. Now, let me give you some explanation of the graph. On the y-axis, what you see is the percentage point difference, okay, across the two economies. The economy with the policy and the economy without policy. The red line is both barriers together, the land policy and social subsidy. So if you take 2013, the red line, we say the percentage point difference is about 10%. So what does it mean? It means that if we observe agriculture employment in China in 2013 is 20%, and we remove this mobility barrier, the agriculture employment share will drop by 9 percentage points to 11%. That's what this exercise shows you. So these are percentage points. Okay? When China starts with 70% of agricultural employment share, it will say that if you have not had this mobility barrier, in 1998, or actually it's not 70% in 1998, I couldn't remember the number. We can go back and see. In 1998, it will be about, so 1998, it will be about 50%. Okay, so half of population, half of the employment labor force in China was in agriculture in 1998, 50%. If you remove those barriers, it would have been 34 percentage points. Okay, so that's what these numbers show. It's a difference in percentage. Okay? What this graph is showing you is a substantial distortion. Substantial. One thing you should be careful is the downward sloping graph doesn't indicate the distortion is getting small. Because when you think about distortion, it's relative what the first best should be. By 2013, the first best is already dropped to 11%. So 9 percentage points out of 11% is actually a very big distortion. So if you look at the ratio of the equilibrium versus the first best, the distortion actually increased. Okay, so this graph shows you just the percentage point, okay, not the ratio. Now, then you ask yourself, among the two margins, which is the important one? Okay, is it the land policy? Should we fix the property rights system in land? Or should we get rid of the hukou system that gives subsidy to based on your urban or rural hukou? Which one is the culprit for this big distortion in industrialization? So we have the green line here. The green line is saying that suppose there's no social subsidy. So all the V and the SU I have in previous formula are set to 0. It doesn't matter. As a farmer, you can always go to the city, work, get the same benefit as everyone else. Let's just get rid of that part. Does that help industrialization? The answer, according to this exercise, is not much. You still have a lot of distortion out of agriculture. In other words, the slow pace of industrialization is mainly due to the land policy, because the green line is as high as the red line. Okay? So if the policy objective is to move people out of agriculture, then fixing the property rights system for land is the important things to do. Okay? So this is the strong message coming out from this quantitative exercise. Without the exercise, it's very hard to know which is the important one, causing the slow transition out of agriculture. So then you turn to urbanization. What a fraction of people working in the urban non-agriculture? Okay? So you can derive the same thing. What you see is now there's an additional parameter that matters, which is eta, the elasticity of substitution across rural and urban group. Now, of course, if eta is high, if it's very easy to substitute the production from the two locations, then it doesn't matter where you produce it. So more people will actually stay in the rural non-agriculture. So the distortion will be higher. The higher is the eta. Okay? So let's use it as elasticity. So we try different elasticity, but I'm going to report you result with an elasticity equal to 2. Okay? This is elasticity many people find in trade literature or in macro literature. But the main message is the same. What you see here is the red line, the 2 dimension of the policy. Again, it's percentage point, okay? Meaning that if I see if I see the urban non-agriculture employment in the actual world is certain percentage, then it is 8 percentage point below the first best. Again, substantial. Because as I showed you early on the employment distribution, the urban employment share is about 20 to 30%. So 8 percentage point is a big number. Okay? It's about 1/3 of the optimal allocation. So again, you can ask the same question, which of this matter most for urbanization? Is it the land policy or is it the social subsidy? In this case, they play a more equal role. Because if you remember that migration condition, there are 3 components. From agriculture into anything non-agriculture, beta play an important role. From rural non-agriculture to urban agriculture, it is the subsidy that play an important role. Okay? So when you move these around, you see that both of them are very important. So if you want to target the issue of urbanization, having just giving property right to own the land, to let them rent it out, is not enough. You also need to extend the hukou benefit to everyone working in a particular location, not what they hold as a hukou. Okay, so that is the important message. So this is just a decomposition for the year 2013. So the first best will tell you agriculture share should be 11.5, whereas in China, we see that it's 20%. This is rural non-agriculture. So first best say 30.7. In actual world, it is 29. Urban non-agriculture, first best say 58. In reality, it's 50. And the decomposition is that land policy is very important for the agriculture share, distorting the pace of industrialization, where subsidy contribute a lot to this pace of urbanization. Okay? So to finish off, some development economists have this very important concept, which is called the subsistence. Okay? So some might question, what you find is too much. Because imagine a world that agriculture is important for survival. This is the idea of subsistence. If you don't have agriculture, you don't have food, people cannot survive. So there's a minimum consumption, CA bar, in agriculture. People need that to survive. And economy has to produce that CA bar. So what's the importance of that? Well, having a CA bar is telling you that there's less substitutability possibility between agriculture and non-agriculture. Because of that, these labor mobility barrier will cause less distortion compared to the first best. Okay? So what I have shown you previously is like the maximum distortion. Because I assume away CA bar, I say there's a lot of possibility to substitute agriculture and non-agriculture good. So you can do this easily and find that depending on the level of the subsistence, so the higher one is that the subsistence is very small. So this is like if the subsistence is only 20% of consumption. This is the case that subsistence is 80%, meaning that the country is very poor. Most of the production really have to go into this subsistence term. What we see is for a big range, still you find important distortion. Okay? So I will leave the quantitative part up to there. So let me just quickly conclude based on the talk so far. So what we argue is that hukou system, through these two margins, land policy and social subsidies, delay the process of industrialization and urbanization. All the distortion of industrialization is due to the land policy, but social subsidies play an important role for the urbanization. So to be very bold, based on what we have set it up here, the policy recommendation coming out of this is that if you manage to define property right on the land carefully, so that farmer can find a way either to rent it out or to sell it, that will help to correct the distortion on industrialization. That will not stop farmer leaving the farm, okay? Because they just get back the land part. What they leave behind is simply the value of marginal product labor. Second, if you extend the full entitlement to social subsidy to everybody work in a location, they pay tax, they get the same benefit, then that will cure the distortion on the urbanization. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. And we have a couple of minutes for questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hand.
Well, very nice talk, and certainly complementary to big ideas that I presented in the previous speech. And this is very detailed, careful analysis of the structural transformation from agriculture to urban industrialization. My question is that, in many countries, they did not have full ecosystem barrier for the migration from agriculture to urban areas, like in Africa and Latin America. But what we observe there are urban unemployment. Many farmers moved to cities, but they did not have a job there. And under the kind of situation, we cannot automatically assume that when you observe the income disparities or productivity disparity in rural area and urban area, and automatically assume the all migration will improve the labor productivity, because that should have a precondition. When they come to the urban areas, they can find a job in industrial sectors, but in the world, we see that's not the case. So that's my first comment. And secondly is that in China, the case of urban land right is some kind of implicit social security system. Because if they migrate to the urban areas, and you have the business cycle and so on, and if they cannot find a job, they can always come back to farm in the rural areas. So if you put your models to consider the risk for migration to the urban areas, and you can certainly have different scenarios. One is that if they don't have any social protection, then what will be the cost to the household? And then secondly, if the government want to introduce the urban unemployment benefit, and under that kind of situation, how much the cost will be, and how that is going to affect your models?
Okay. Well, these are very challenging questions, so I try my best to answer part of it. And lots of the other part, I have to go back and work on it. So the first question about, for many countries, they migrate. There's look like there's nothing stopping them. They just pack their bag and they go to the urban area, but they don't find a job. So how do we think about that? Is it really, always good for them to leave? I think this sort of related to very earlier work by Harrison Todaro. When you move to the city, there's this risk. You might find job, you might not find job. But as a, I would say myself, neoclassical economist, if we believe people are not forced to leave, if they choose to leave, that means when they take that decision, they already factor in the uncertainty. So what they equalize is the expected outcome with the outcome they have in agriculture. Many of these unemployed people in the urban sector, it does not mean that they will have much better time if they remain on the farm. So from that perspective, I'm not too concerned that we do see people go into the city and end up being idle. Because in equilibrium, it must be that before they leave, they see the picture that they might get something better than the agriculture. So what is happening is they are equalizing the expected return in the city versus what they see for sure in agriculture. Okay? Now, my main point is just that in addition to all this, we shouldn't put additional barrier to stop the movement. So my statement is that even in such a world, to have this policy that distort the incentive is still not healthy. Okay, so that, I hope, sort of addressed the first question. Now, in the second question, about the social security, indeed it's true, but still, I think I see it as not contradicting to what I'm saying. Even if you want to get farmer a place to go back to, like in your presentation you mentioned, as the economy move on, some of the labor-intensive sector is disappearing. So many of these low-skilled workers, what do they have to do? They either have to upgrade themselves, get the training into other sector, or they just go back to their farm. So having the land there is good. That I completely agree, from a social policy point of view. It's not just efficiency, it's also equity. But I think it doesn't contradict to giving them the right to rent out the land while they are a migrant. Because my point is that the fact that they cannot rent out the land, when they make that migration decision, there's always this distortion. They're not just thinking about their marginal product of labor, they're thinking about the marginal product of labor and the rent. That distorts their decision to move into the urban sector. So giving them the full property right so that they can rent it out, then they can come back to it. Now, of course, you might say there are some information problems. Some farmer may be silly. They have too much rosy picture of the urban, and they end up selling their land. So by the time they wanted to go back, there's nowhere for him to go back. Now, this always happens in reality, the information problem about the future. And we just can't do much. But with this in mind, if we give them that possibility, they can rent it out, then they can leave, not having to be hindered by that rent concern in their mind. They can still always go back. So maybe giving them the right to sell may not be good because many of these farmers do not have full information. They might make the wrong decision. But giving them the right to rent it out may be a compromise because they can always go back and work on the land again. So, yeah.
Okay,
so a voice to the European Union that comes with you, by the way. So, Professor Justin Lin, the fact that China is a market economy is true, but not in agriculture. This is a big mistake. European Union is based on a great reform in agriculture. This Europe, so rich, so welfare, is based on the reform that has been done in the 50s and 60s. First, the land to the farmer. Secondly, agriculture is not a sector different from industry, it's simply industry, agro-industry. Then the data of today of European Union shows that the true farmers are only 9 million, but the sector of agro-industry has 30 million workers. People working in the agri-industrial sector are 30 million. Proportionally to China means that whenever you arrive to the 11%, you are arriving to a minimum, not lower than 11%. You have first 1,300,000 inhabitants. You need then more farmers than in Europe, much more. Secondly, the technology of the agro-industry today are avionics. As you do an aeroplane, you do a machinery to harvesting. The price of machinery is more than 1 million euro per one. Just one, you know? And every farm must have the harvesting machine for the fruit, for the wheat, for the soybean, for the corn. So this is the El Dorado of the European economy, you know? And the agro-industrial system is the 20-25% of the GDP of Europe. Then your courageous research for sure go in the right direction, but must be implemented by the last point, you know, conclusion. Second point, if you don't give the land rights to the farmer, this golden card will never be played in China. And then as soon as you delay, the worst is, because the other countries also nearby, let's see, Indonesia, let's see, Vietnam, let's see. All the others, India itself, are doing a great effort on this sector. That is the sector of the future, by the way, because more and more the agriculture is biologic, more and more people is caring the health, they don't put chemical inside, the less chemical, the more workers. You know, that is the paradox. So you rent the job in the sector because you don't have farmers. And then, that's to say, you open and light a sector that many times is marginalized but is crucial for growth and development in all over the countries, but specifically for China. So I compliment.
Thank you very much. So it's good to know that, you know, that second bullet point is something. Actually, to add it to your observation, one thing that is very important coming out of here is that by removing this barrier, by making people follow the right economic incentive to leave agriculture, you also give room to these technology upgrade. When there's less people there, then that's the time when they will invest in more capital-intensive farm technology. Like the observation you observe, like in US, in many European countries, you have very small fraction of labor force working in the farm, but produce so much agriculture output. Because labor not there, they adopt big tractor. So one farmer can farm acres of land. In the case of many developing countries and China, they still use very traditional tools because there are a lot of labor sitting there on the farm. And it's cheap to use, so you use them. So that's one point on the technology adoption. The second point is about the training of the farmer themselves. If they're always being held back by the land they might lose, the rent of the land they might lose, they will not leave. So they do not see the necessity of upgrading themselves to acquire human capital, to adapt to the modern world of the modern sectors. So from both ends, the adoption of agriculture technology and the retraining of the farmer themselves, it's important to remove this barrier. Echoing what Justin said earlier on, it's about upgrading. But with this barrier in place, there's no incentive to upgrade. There's this cheap labor there. So if you remove them, the endowment change in that farm sector, they will upgrade. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Wen, thank you.
This on? Okay. Well, it's a very interesting talk. It's a sort of typical American university trained economist paper. Okay. I mean, it's not that the issues you picked are not there. I mean, every nation, even you go to the US, you find barriers, you find those kind of policies there. I mean, this is there, right? But my point, the point I want to make is that there are lots of first-order important things which are missing in this kind of exercise. It's not your fault. The whole paradigm cannot address those questions. So in that regard, I agree with your open remark. This is complementary to what Justin said earlier. He tried to paint the big picture, those first-order important things. Now let me come back to this paper. What is the first-order important things here from my point of view? You assume that for any nation, started from 5,000 years ago, there were always two industries people can choose. If you don't have freedom to choose, you distort the economy. That's wrong. Where does the second technology, the industry technology, come from? If you don't have that technology, you push the farmer into the city for what? right? So it's the growth or the emerge of that technology which pull farmers out of their countryside. That's the most important driving force. Everything else is secondary. So Justin talked about how can they, go to African country. They don't have second technology. Farmers are idle in the countryside. It's not they have a hukou system. There's no opportunity for them to go to cities. But how can the government design the right industrial policy to make the labor-intensive industry blossom in somewhere? So therefore, you can pull the farmers out. So those are the first order important things, right? And also, historically, if we look at the US, you said that even today's China, in terms of rural population share or value-added share, is equivalent to 1920 US. It's 100 years gap. Sounds enormous, right? China's still very backward. But if you look at starting from what point in the US back in history, equivalent to 1980s China, developed to the status of 1920. It took them more than 100 years, perhaps 150 years. And why it took the US so long and for China to so short? It's not because the US had a hukou system or even something other, it's something else. So those are, I think, are the first order important questions that we need to keep in mind. It's nothing against this kind of exercise, but they most often pick up the secondary issues. Okay, thanks.
So I have to disagree on many aspects. It's my job to disagree. Now, I think there's something that is missing in your statement. We do not push them out. We do not push the farmer out of the farm. They choose it. You are right. They choose it if the value of marginal product of labor is higher in non-agriculture. How can that be higher? If there is such technology there with high productivity, high reward, then they will leave voluntarily. No one is pushing them. What I'm talking about is something that's dragging them back. So I didn't tell you anything about productivity, all those AU, AR, A. They can take anything. I'm talking about a comparative paradigm. Okay? Technology can be evolving in both paradigms. In a paradigm with hukou system and in a paradigm without hukou system. Of course, if this technology evolves faster, then the pace will be faster, not just in the policy equilibrium, also in the first best equilibrium. I agree with you, in the case of US, it takes long because we are talking about 19th century. All the technology are just developing, but China is in the 21st century. The technology are there. The question is, why don't they adopt it? That's the difference between effective technology. It's more about innovation. Of course, these technology has to be there for them to move. But we are in the 20th century, in the 21st century. If they want, they could adopt this technology. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of trade between China and US in terms of this technology. They could have adopted. So, no, let's talk one thing at a time, because if you start flowing me 100 countries, I won't be able to handle it. Let's just focus on this one thing at a time. So my point is not that these technology are not important. My point is, even with the technology, if you have this policy of pulling the leg of the farmer, they can't leave. And worst of all, because they can't leave, it slows down the adoption of the technology. And there's a feedback effect. It makes the transition even slower. Okay? That's my point. We can't compare how many years it takes US to do the transition, which is in the 19th century, to China now. Because China has all the options there. They could use these farm technology are out there. They could use it. Why didn't they use it? In the US, they would just develop those trucks and everything. So the point is not that these are not important. Of course, technology are important. Of course, the existence of the sectors are important. Okay? That's, of course, true. But what I'm trying to say is, even if those things are there, if you have this policy, that stop people from moving, distorting people's incentive, you will slow down the process. So it's relative to that world I'm talking about. Now, of course, even for the first best, inventing this technology, having this technology available is the first order issue. So on that, I agree with you. But I disagree that this is not an important issue. Yes.
That's not important. It's compared to the first best, which is enormous. The first best is enormous.
I mean, no.
Congratulations for the presentation. It's very interesting. I'm not an expert on this field, but I follow, and it's very interesting. I think you have another challenge. Is you placed barriers to go out, and I'm asking the barriers to go in. Suppose the foreign direct investment goes into agriculture and brings technology. So if we compare this with what happened in 1979 onwards with industry, we can also develop a lot the agriculture. And a lot of people will go to the agriculture with technology and knowledge. I can tell you that in Portugal we have that situation. In the past we have very poor productivity in agriculture. And a lot of people went out because we don't have barriers, so they went out to industry and services. And now we are seeing people going back to agriculture, but different people. People which has post-graduations, master degrees in universities. They know what they are doing, they take the right technology. And for instance, in olive oil, we are now leaders, and we were quite backwards in that sense. So I think that's another barrier to go in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, actually this point is a very good point and related to what we mentioned earlier on.
Yeah.
So what I show about people going out is the employment share. What you talk about is bringing in new technology to upgrade the agriculture. And that can happen together. When there's less cheap labor, you have this more advanced thing. Okay, industry upgrading is better form of agriculture. When you identify yourself, have comparative advantage in producing olive oil in that beautiful country with the heat and everything. So you have investment coming in, but not the...
Invest in China in agriculture?
In China, I think the foreign direct investment can come in, but it has to be the farmer who is willing to adopt it. Exactly. Yeah.
Without renting or selling?
Yeah. Which is another reason why when you give the property... Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your response. And I fully agree it would be desirable to give the right to rent land when they leave the rural areas. But in effect, that is the practice has been in China for quite some time. Farmer can lease their land to other farmers when they move out of their village. That's one thing. And the second is, I still want to come back to my question. Maybe I did not phrase my question in a very clear way. Because it would be necessary for the government to find a social security system to protect people when they lose the job. And to have those kind of social security system also require cost, resources. And for example, if you put a model, this element into your model, because the government can do two things. One is to use the resources to have a social security system to provide protection to urban workers, including those farmers who move to the urban areas. And if they use the kind of resources, they will reduce the resources available for improving infrastructure. But infrastructure will be essential for industrialization. And so there's a cost. And because now the government relies on the more traditional way of land right system in rural areas, the government does not have to pay so much cost for the social security system. But if they want to remove the land right system as you recommended, the government will have to increase its resources for the urban social security system. And if you build in that into the models, I think at least you need to soften your statement about the land rights system in rural areas. And maybe for a low-income country like China in the 1980s, 1990s, it would be more desirable to have full ecosystem instead of the social security system. Because at that time, fundamentally, the government resources was very limited. Either they use the resources to improve infrastructure, so to facilitate industrialization, or they use that resources in an alternative way for social security system. And so they can have, removing the full ecosystem and give the freedom to the farmer. So it's a choice.
Maybe I didn't answer clear either. So I do not see if you just give them the right to rent it out, that doesn't remove their security. They can go back and not rent it again. That's the first point. So I don't see how that can remove the security. Second point about, if they are in the urban and they are unemployed, if we have to finance their, unemployment insurance, let's say, that will increase the cost of government. Well, what is going on is they are paying taxes, okay, either directly or indirectly because their employer are paying tax. But what they pay is going to the urban worker. So there's an implicit transfer from the migrant to the urban worker. When we construct the social subsidy, there are unemployment insurance, there are assistance to the urban worker who is unemployed, but not the migrant who is unemployed. What I'm saying is just that, to be fair, everybody who pays tax benefit from it, because that will reduce the incentive distortion for these people to join the urban workforce. So on both, I think, it's there. Now, of course, if you want to increase everybody's unemployment benefit, then you have to find the resources. Now, that is a bigger question, which is, can China going on with such low tax system and with such low social service to the people? Now, that's something bothers me at a personal level. Every time when I go to China, when I talk to people who are the poor people who do not have the privilege to go to private hospital, and I see how they suffer, that is a bigger question, which I do not tend to address here. But on the first point about the security of the migrant, I think what I propose, if anything, is improvement for them. They can rent it out. When they decided they don't want to be a migrant anymore, they go back. And also I'm saying that instead of having them implicitly subsidizing the urban worker, give them their share. They are paying the tax, so let them enjoy the same services. So I'm not saying increase the total spending. All I'm saying is redistribute the spending. Don't give all the spending to the urban hukou. Give back to the person who paid the tax. So that's the thing, I think maybe I wasn't clear. So from that perspective, I see this as an improvement for them. Now, of course, on the overall welfare system in China, which I'm extremely concerned, given the privileged group of people is so small, a lot of people are struggling with their, old age, health, and everything. I don't know. That's a very big question that you can do a big part in talking to the government. Something needs to be done. They can't survive with such low tax and do nothing for their people. Oops.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this, and thank you, everybody, for the questions and the argument.